Hello. Hello. Thank you for being here today. Such an honor to be here. What a beautiful campus. It's my first time here. You're very lucky to be here, especially in this time of the year. It's so beautiful and inspiring. And precisely, we're going to talk about space today, space and identity in French cinema. I'd like to start with a 1949 article that was written by one of the most influential film critics in France after World War II, namely André Bazin. His works is being reassessed. I mean, he wrote 2,500 articles. It's extremely stimulating to read. And one article caught my attention in particular. It's called The Tour de France of Cinema. Everybody knows the Tour de France. So the Tour de France of Cinema. What is Bazin talking about in this text? Well, in 1949, Bazin is disappointed by the fact that French films are not French cinema is not really showcasing the diversity of French landscapes. He thought that landscapes in French film after the liberation were a little bit abstract. And he wished that films reflected the specificity of such and such landscape. And he's very specific because he refers to how geography was taught when he was a young boy at school. And this is quite interesting to us because, first of all, from a geographical perspective, as you can see on this beautiful geological map, France is a country that has very diverse landscapes. It's extremely diversified. So you have Brittany, the Massif Central, crystalline rocks. Here you have sedimentary areas. Every single region is so different, which is one of the reasons that France is a very popular destination. What Bazin had in mind was the degree to which film would showcase the diversity of landscapes, but what he had in mind as well was a political agenda. Let's keep in mind that geography in France did have this political perspective, especially from the inception of the Third Republic on, around 1870. Geography was considered as a discipline that would fuel and foster one's attachment to France as a nation. And this is really interesting because the context of French filmmaking in 1949 is a specific one in terms of nation. So let's dig deeper into that. Bazin wrote his article in the context of post-World War II, in the context of liberation. And back then, there was a sense of excitement due to the liberation of France, of course. But people were also very excited because of the American way of life. And that included an unprecedented wave of American films that had been censored during World War II. So just imagine these millions of French women and men who would just flock to theaters to see all these films that had been previously censored during World War II. Amongst the crowd, there were a couple of people who would later become very famous, and that includes many directors of the French New Wave. François Truffaut or Jean-Luc Godard. They were 13, 14, 15 when they would see these films after the liberation, so they were part of that excitement. But according to Bazin, there was a problem because many people in France thought that this would boost the Americanization of French society. And what film critic André Bazin had in mind was that landscapes in French films should be more specific, more beautiful. And his idea was that the presence of French landscapes would fuel French national identity amongst viewers. And this is precisely what I'd like to discuss today, the politics of space in French films. So first, let's cast a light on what I'm tempted to call the geography of belonging through film. French filmmakers have been fueling a sense of identity through space using several strategies. A first strategy would consist in staging a landmark monument or an iconic landscape or cityscape. Another strategy, which I'm going to elaborate on, consisted in celebrating the everyday life, the French lifestyle, through the representation of small-scale spaces. So let's start with the first strategy, staging a landmark monument or an iconic landscape. This strategy was used by so many directors over the course of the history of French filmmaking, and in particular in the 1980s and 90s with the advent of the so-called nostalgia film. There was a huge wave of films that were characterized by a sense of nostalgia that would present the viewers with the so-called timeless characteristics of the so-called Frenchness, quote-unquote Frenchness. This film, which you may have studied in your classes, is a perfect example of this. First of all, do you recognize that landscape if you've been to France? Does that look familiar? La Provence, oui, bien sûr. La Provence, absolument. We have beautiful mountains made out of limestone. They're very dry and yet beautiful. So this is from the films made by Yves Robert, My Mother's Castle, My Father's Glory, based on the novels by Marcel Pagnol. These films are set in southern France, one of the most popular French regions. And Provence presents us with a timeless cliché of France. It presents us with its tradition, its lavender, the southern accent, and, as I said, these magnificent mountains overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. This film is slowing down the pace of time. It is a very comforting image of France amongst certain viewers who had to cope with an acceleration of history in France in the 1980s and the 1990s. Hence, the huge success of nostalgia films in that period. So here, staging a landmark monument or an iconic landscape satisfies the viewer's desire to experience a geography of an essentialized conception of France. No wonder many French region councils financially contribute to the making of films in France. If you pay close attention to the closing credits at the end of a film, you'll probably see the logo of a French region such as Provence, Aquitaine, Île-de-France, Brittany, and so forth. And this is extremely interesting because the French region councils elaborated this strategy in order to make the regions more attractive, possibly more successful. It would boost tourism and local economy. And as a whole, the goal is also to convey a sense of belonging, a sense of identity. And I'm sure that André Bazin would have been extremely happy with those films. So obviously, this conception of filmmaking can be called into question, and hoping that we can discuss that together afterwards. Another strategy consists in celebrating the everyday life through small-scale spaces. The idea is to represent spaces that look familiar and that in many cases convey a sense of territory. Small-scale spaces are quite often celebrations of the French way of life. representing the everyday life in a way that viewers can relate to what they see. And I'd like to take 3 examples. And I think that each of these examples show that the representation of space goes hand in hand with French politics. So let's start with this slide from The Crime of Mr. Lange by famous director Jean Renoir, 1935. Have you seen this film in one of your classes? No? Have you seen any Renoir movies?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
What? Yes!
Louder.
What have you seen?
I forget. I'm sorry.
But you did.
Toi, tu as vu
He forgot to. That's fine.
Non, elle a vu La Grande Illusion. Il y en a qui ont vu aussi
The rules of the game?
La règle du jeu.
La règle du jeu, the rules of the game. So this is, and this one, so you've seen. So this is an earlier film, The Crime of Mr. Lange. So I don't know if you can really see the composition of the frame, but part of the stylistic signature of Jean Renoir was that type of framing that can be described as an all-inclusive framing scale. By all-inclusive, I mean that many characters are in the frame. And in Renoir, Renoir was not a huge fan of close-ups. Why was that? Because he didn't want to place the emphasis on individuality. And in that period, specifically in the 1930s, the emphasis was placed on collective identity. And that made perfect sense, because the film being made in 1935, it means that many people had to cope with the side effects of the Great Depression, starting in 1929. People were exposed to quite a few hardships, and Renoir wanted to make a political statement by representing the collective power of the people as a whole. In addition, 1935, it's just 1 year before the Popular Front, 1936, and this film was meant to be some kind of quote-unquote propaganda, in the positive sense of the word, propaganda, so that people would vote for the Popular Front in 1936.
Can you remind them briefly what the Popular Front is?
Of course, and the Popular Front was a political movement that brought together all the progressive political forces in France on the left and the center-left in order to fight back, in order to resist the rise of fascism and Nazism in Europe. Let's keep in mind that in 1934 there were riots in Paris, people taking to the streets and trying to undermine the political regime. So the leftist forces organized themselves in order to make a statement. And Renoir was part of that trend, and what's fascinating is that you can tell based on the composition of the frame. It's always like that in Renoir's films, especially during that period. Another example from a different period would be the films made by Jacques Tati. Jacques Tati is another extremely famous director who was concerned and who was a bit defensive when he saw the evolution of France as a society, as France in the wake of the liberation was becoming more and more modern. 1958 is the date of the very first supermarket in France, for instance. It's a symptom of Americanization to a certain degree in France. And it is exactly in 1958 that Tati made My Uncle, which is a film about this transition from the old world to the new world. It is during this period and then in the early 1960s that these grands ensembles, these projects were built to accommodate a booming population. It was the baby boom. And it had significant side effects on how traditions would slowly but surely vanish. So what's very interesting in that film is that Tati does exaggerate French identity in order to counterbalance the Americanization of French society. He was nostalgic in his time, and it's a bit strange from our perspective to see that this film presents us with a description of France that seems to come back from the 19th century. There are many horses in that film, so I'm not sure there were many horses in the streets of Paris in 1958, but he wanted to make a point. And it's a wonderful film, by the way. I strongly encourage you to watch it. The film won an Academy Award in Hollywood in 1958, and Americans were very pleased. Interestingly, they were very, very pleased to see the film because they could see this eternal France that so many Americans back then were dreaming of. 1958. A third example, and I'm going to play a clip, is a very iconic film that you're probably very familiar with, but I'd like to do some clip analysis with you. So we're going to take a moment to analyze the composition of the frame. We're going to take a moment to analyze details that you don't necessarily pay attention to when you watch a film. And yet those details sometimes, possibly, they may have a political agenda. The director may not necessarily be aware of that. It's just that the director is making his or her film in a specific context and may be influenced by the dominant conception of identity and the dominant conception of politics when the film was made. And that will translate into the type of lighting that the director is going to choose, the composition of the frame, and many technical details that we are going to analyze together. So the clip is about 1 minute and 30 seconds.
Amélie a soudain le sentiment étrange d'être en harmonie totale avec elle-même. Tout est parfait en cet instant. La douceur de la lumière, ce petit parfum dans l'air, la rumeur tranquille de la ville. Elle inspire profondément et la vie lui paraît alors si simple et si limpide qu'un élan d'amour, comme un désir d'aider l'humanité entière, la submerge tout à coup.
Venez, je vous aider. On descend et hop, c'est parti. Là, on croise la veuve du tambour de la fanfare. Elle porte la vareuse de son mari depuis qu'il est mort. Attention, hop. Tiens, l'enseigne de la boucherie Chevalier n'a perdu une oreille. Ce rire, c'est celui du mari de la fleuriste. Il a des petites rides de malice au coin des yeux. Oh, dans la vitrine de la pâtisserie, il y a des sucettes Pierrot Gourmand. Vous sentez ce parfum? C'est Pépone qui fait goûter ses melons aux clients.
Allez, montez en melon.
Ah, c'est Marion, il faut de la glace au calisson. On passe devant la charcuterie. 79 le jambon à l'os, 45 le travers de micelle. On arrive chez le fromager, 12,90 le picodon de l'Ardèche et 23,50 le cabico du Poitou. Chez le boucher, il y a un bébé qui regarde un chien qui regarde les poulets rôtis. Voilà, maintenant on est devant le petit kiosque à journaux, juste à l'entrée du métro. Et moi je vous laisse ici. Au revoir.
Okay. Did you notice anything about the lighting, the music, camera movements, anything?
Don't be shy.
Is it, yes?
The music seemed to speed up like as they're walking along, so it started off kind of at a general pace and then it got a lot quicker, so
Yes.
it was heightened and the camera started moving more quickly.
Absolutely. There's a sense of rhythm, which is conveyed by the music. Did you recognize a few instruments?
Accordéon.
You did? Accordéon. So accordéon is almost, it's very interesting that there is an accordéon because it's almost a cliché of France. It's something that it's almost a code. It's an encoded conception of the soundtrack here that prepares our brain to embrace the quote-unquote Frenchness of that film. The accordion. All right. What else? The rhythm.
Well, the shops are small. Everything is small, individual shops. And the whole film is actually a step. When you see that film, you're kind of looking at Paris back when, back in the good days, or well, not the good days,
Uh-huh.
but old days.
But before we see the shop, there's a shot of her crossing the bridge, and you see a really beautiful panorama of the town from the bridge.
Now the monuments.
We see monuments. Yes. Even if you've never been to France, you can tell that there are monuments out there, and this shot is so smart because there's something a bit odd that we do not pay attention to, but subconsciously, if I may use that word, our brain is understanding, is getting a message here. It's crooked, yes.
Well, which monument is it? It looks like the Académie Française, but I'm not sure.
Maybe.
Académie Française.
I don't know what monument it is, but it strikes me that there's absolutely no crowds of tourists, which kind of gives you an impression of what Paris is.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Quote unquote authentic Paris.
Yeah.
So when we watch that film, oh, we're there. It's real Paris.
Yeah.
Quote unquote. Real with no tourists. Yes, maybe the fantasy of Paris. I want to be the only one to be in Paris. For the record, France attracts 80 million people every year. It's number one so far. Anything about, yes, the monument, even if you're not familiar with Paris, it's the Institut de France, in front of the Pont des Arts. But even if you're not familiar, it doesn't really matter because Amélie suddenly has a strange feeling of complete harmony. Even if you do not hear that, you can tell based on the composition of the frame, because her head is exactly the same shape as the dome.
And she's in the same line with the post.
Yeah, that's interesting.
She's echoing the presence of the monument. She's really part of Paris. That young lady, I'm telling you, she's a Parisienne. You can tell visually. Of course, the director thought about that because the director needs to think about the haircut, the camera angle, the cinematography. Speaking of which, the cinematography, there's something a bit odd about that type of lighting. It's slightly greenish. If you see that in a movie theater, you would say that it's
It almost looks like an old colorized postcard.
an old postcard, colorized postcard that was a bit tarnished or over time, a bit sepia, a little bit maybe. So it's an old picture. You have the sense of maybe it's old, so the lighting is sending the message that the film is a little bit about nostalgia. And it makes perfect sense because then the camera's panning and we're going to see the beautiful Seine River, the very heart of Paris. But what do we see on the other side? It is another monument. If you've been to Paris, this is the Louvre Museum. And the Louvre Museum, by definition, has many, many antiques in it. So from the beginning of the shot to the end, we have this sense of connection with the past, which is made visible by the lighting, by the choice of monuments, and it is also made audible by the choice of the soundtrack. And as you said later on, boutiques the small-scale communities play a huge role in that film.
It's kind of interesting that it starts with these larger spaces and goes quickly to the intimate spaces.
Yes. Yes. I would agree with that, yes. The old cobblestones. Little boutiques. And she's going to take care, like an angel, she's going to take care of that man and describing all the things he cannot see. She's going to try to establish a connection between this man and the romanticized conception of France. It's very, very colorful. And also, the ending of the clip is particularly interesting because, as you said, we're getting closer and closer to the detailed small-scale spaces, but it's ending very nicely with what? With a crane shot representing the local neighborhood. In other words, what do we see? We see the community. And we see the connection of all these people who live together in a given neighborhood. So the sense of identity does go hand in hand with the sense of place. And this clip is fascinating because we could certainly interpret it as the symptom, as the sign, a sign of the times. The film was released in 2001 after in the context of a certain evolution of French society. It is interesting that this film triggered quite a few controversies in France, believe it or not. At first glance, it looks like some kind of entertainment that does not necessarily have a controversial political agenda. But there were quite a few magazines, quite a few journalists on the left side of the spectrum in France, the progressive side of the political stage in France, who argued that this film was extremely conservative because it was set in the past, because it was way too nostalgic. Some critics went as far as to say that this film was making a case for the far right, the Front National, the National Front, the xenophobic party. Some said that. Maybe we can discuss what you think afterwards. So in any case, it shows that there is indeed a connection between space and politics, and it's particularly interesting to dig deeper into that by casting a light on what was going on in France since the 1980s. Let's talk about the fact that many people thought that France was losing its identity, slowly but surely, especially with the advent of the European Union. Let's keep in mind that France lost its currency, the francs. So maybe this scene is some kind of fantasy for the days when people would buy things using their francs with beautiful notes representing French artists and writers. These times were gone with the euro. So many people have been complaining about, excuse me my word, but how ugly the euro banknotes were. People were not happy with that in France, and it was seen as a loss of identity. The crisis of the farmers. France is a country based on agriculture. France takes pride in its agricultural products. 36,000 cities and villages in France. It is part of the identity. The debates gravitating around the French cultural exception. There was a controversy between France and the US in the 1990s because France and Hollywood in particular wanted to export so many American blockbusters, and the French tried to resist that by claiming that cultural products were not like any commodity, that it was important to protect one's identity through culture and through films. So this film was made in this context, and this is fascinating because it does translate to some degree into how a film is made. So, not every single French filmmaker is embracing that type of conception of identity. To put it differently, not every single French filmmaker is embracing an essentialized conception of identity. What is essentializing identity? It's a process through which national identity is seen as timeless and eternal. France is France. If you say something like that, it means that you have a certain conception of France is, was, and should be. And it is a form of essentialization. There are quite a few directors in France who refuse that and who actually embrace a different type of conception of space because they think that identity is a construct, a historical construct based on cultural diversity. So let's take a few examples. A first genre would be the French road movies. A road movie is a film genre in which the main characters leave home on a road trip, typically challenging the perspective from their everyday lives. There's quite a few examples of that, people looking for who they are or who they want to be. And this is inscribed in their movement in space. And it's very interesting because the French landscapes are not attached to some kind of symbolism, or they're not attached to an essentialized conception of identity. They're not attached to a cliché or a stereotype of France. What we see in those road movies is the quest for identity. So Drôle de Félix, for instance, or Western by Manuel Poirier, or Vagabond by Agnès Varda, who's such a fantastic director, because over the course of her career, she always made it clear that identity was always a process, and that identity is all about a collection of fragments. Maybe you've seen this beautiful film, Les Plages d'Agnès, in which we see fragments of mirrors floating in the wind on a beach. And it's very poetic, it's so beautiful, and she's basically saying that this is what identity is. I don't really know who I am. My grandchildren, you know what? I don't really know them, and they don't really know me. It's quite a statement to make for a grandmother, isn't it? But you can see that in the type of space she chose in her film, and especially with the display of those broken mirrors floating in the wind. Another aspect of identity as a construct is, of course, multiculturalism and the celebration of cultural diversity. So I'm just going to go over this. It's a very important aspect. But maybe we can save this for the discussion. There's quite a few directors who want to showcase the degree to which France is a country that was based on waves of immigrants. And maybe it's not the image that we have on France based on the stereotypes or based on the media coverage. But from a historical perspective, this is what happened in France. And an iconic director in this respect would be Robert Guédiguian. All his films are set in the Marseille area, which was a gateway for millions of immigrants for many, many, many years. And he's fighting constantly, film after film, to make films that are reminders of this diversity. And many of his films precisely show how the National Front is having a rising influence. But again and again, he's fighting this in his films. And this is a statement that can be traced back to Jean Renoir in the 1930s in a film entitled Tony. At the beginning of the film, Renoir is making it clear that the Mediterranean Sea has always integrated people century after century. And if you think about that, this is such an interesting problematic because the thread of events unfolding right now in the Mediterranean Sea show that we need these directors to think about this problematic. So, I see that time flies. So as a conclusion, I would like to say that every time we watch a film, we don't necessarily pay attention to space because we're moved, we're touched, we're energized by the plot, by the action, and by the characters. But the plot, the action, and the characters are all set in a cinematic space that is carefully chosen and staged by filmmakers. I would say that the staging of space in films... Oh, this is a reminder, time's up. I'm sorry. I'll be good. I'll be short. I'll typically use the same reminder when I cook at home, so I felt a bit disturbed. And where's the oven? No. I would say that the staging of space in film is a political statement. No doubt about that. I'm absolutely convinced that space is a political statement. Every time we watch a film, we are drawing pleasure from it, and we don't necessarily think about the politics in it. And to tell you the truth, there's nothing wrong about loving a film without thinking about it too much. It doesn't make you a bad person at all. With that in mind, I think that we should be aware of the fact that films sometimes do have a political agenda that is not always detectable by the viewer at first glance. Let me put it differently. Films are important because they entertain us, but they also provide us with an opportunity to experience a different type of pleasure, which is the pleasure of critical thinking. Again, there's nothing wrong with enjoying beautiful landscapes and monuments in films. I love that. I love to recognize such and such monument. I love to recognize such and such streets in Paris. I've been there. It's part of the pleasure of spectatorship. But film spectatorship is also about the power that we have as students, faculty, citizens, mothers, fathers, the power that we have to discuss and criticize films for the sake of our pleasure and for the sake of our intellectual integrity and freedom. Thank you very much. Yes.
But I was wondering to what extent you felt that the documentary maybe engages with French identity in perhaps a different way, or is it the same way? Some of these guys are going to see Le Chagrin et la Pitié very soon.
Oui.
Others are going to see Être et avoir.
Oui.
So I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about that.
So have you seen To Be and To Have, Être et Avoir, or are you going to see? Ah, okay. So maybe I cannot talk about that film too much, maybe then. I don't want to spoil the film. In my opinion, it's just me, but in my opinion, I would say that there's no difference between fiction and documentary in this respect. There's no difference whatsoever. Let's talk about documentary a little bit. If I say documentary, there's maybe an expectation that the director will be quote-unquote objective or informative because it's a documentary about reality. So that's the expectations. You want to see reality. That's something, in my opinion, again, it's just me, but it's something that you can completely forget because this is not happening. As soon as a director uses a certain camera angle, as soon as a director makes decision during the shooting of a film, be a fiction film or a documentary, as soon as a filmmaker is editing the film, there are decisions to be made based on the director's vision of the world. And in To Be and To Have, Être et Avoir, it's a magnificent documentary about school, the French school system in the countryside in France at the beginning of the 21st century. It was released in 2002, as far as I remember. It was a huge success in France. Millions of people saw that documentary, which was unheard of for a documentary. It was a documentary, however, that had a very specific conception of national identity, because I would argue that this film is essentializing what school should be, and it's a conception that comes, a specific conception of education that comes from the Third Republic, based on the authority of the master, le maître, in the school. This is a film that has a very interesting conception of space. The emphasis is placed on closed spaces. The classroom is closed. The beginning of the film, it's opening with an inflatable globe, and the turtle is playing with it, and it's snowing hard. There's a snowstorm outside. So you feel so safe because you want to play with a turtle in the inside, of course. And there's nothing wrong about that. I want to be inside myself. It looks very cold. Auvergne, which is the region where it was shot, it's so cold in the winter. However, the director is interested in the concept of boundaries. The conception of school that is developed in that film is a conception of school that is not really open onto the outside world. Authority is very important. The teacher is doing some advising when he's sitting by a magnificent tree. What a beautiful shot. But it reminds us of the conception of monarchy in France. Kings, Saint Louis, they would speak, they would do justice under an oak or under a tree. It's part of the cliché. Now that I'm a professor in the US, I can tell you that the conception of teaching is certainly not based on a hierarchy like that. It's a very French conception of teaching that comes from the Third Republic. And at some point, the school master says, okay, now, yeah, you're graduating, congratulations, you're going to the middle school. Be careful. It's the city over there. It's dangerous. That is the message that is being sent. And it's a bit disturbing because everything looks so beautiful and natural. So you're tempted to say, oh, this is reality. How can you stage reality? And how can you direct 3 years old? It's not possible. So you buy what you see. However, I would argue that there is a certain agenda from the director. And there's nothing wrong about enjoying this agenda, but at least let's be aware of it so we can make a decision by ourselves with our own critical mind. What do you think, François?
I completely agree.
A question. Some students discussed Line this morning in class, and I wanted to bring it up because Line, directed by Mathieu Kassovitz, who plays in Amélie.
Yes.
As well. And we have a banlieue film in '95 that he directs, not the first time, but the iconic banlieue movie in France. And 6 years later, he plays in the anti-banlieue film, the nostalgia of France before immigration, before anything. Could you comment to help the students understanding this two polarized idea of France?
Oh, yes, a very interesting comment. I don't know if Kassovitz was reminded of what looks like a contradiction, but it's very true that in La Haine, Hate, in this film, Kassovitz is being very vocal about how social exclusion is created in part by geographical, spatial exclusion. Let's keep in mind that in Paris, you have the Paris city center, which is surrounded by a highway, le périphérique, and there is such a stigma that is attached to everyone who's living on the other side of the highway. So Kassovitz in Hate is certainly criticizing the notion of territory, because when people are stuck in territories, they become violent, they become resentful, bitter, and there are so many scenes when these young men from the banlieue, from the outskirts of Paris, go to Paris city center to have fun, but they realize that they are nobody and that people look down at them. And I wish I had this clip, because Kassovitz is such a great director in that film, because he's creating a specific effect with his lens to show that these guys are excluded from Paris city center. The background is completely blurred. In the jargon of cinema studies, we say that it's a shallow focus shot. And we don't see Paris. Why is that? Because they're so lonely and excluded that they don't know what to do, and they're nobody. The fact that he's playing in Amélie a couple of years later is ironical, if not disturbing, because, as I said, quite a few journalists pointed out that Amélie's political agenda may be a bit questionable. How can you make a film that is casting a light on inequalities and racism and violence? And how can you play in a film that will make a case for an eternal, if not a conservative, conception of identity?
Where there is not one black person, not one person from Arab descent, with the exception of Lucien, played by Debose, but they are invisible in the film.
Yes, yes, and it's a very good point, because whenever you see a film, think about what you see, who you see, what you hear, but think about the invisible characters as well. Who's not in the film? That's something to keep in mind. Who's not in the film? The off-screen space in cinema studies also has a political agenda. And the only character from Northern African descent is a cliché, so to speak. It's a cliché.
He's almost slow, right? He's a slow, the term is retarded, he's mentally slow, and that's the only one in the movie. So
it's what this bunch of film critics pointed out. The fact that the only character of Northern African descent is a little bit childish is very patronizing, and is a reminder of how French colonization looked down at colonized people who were considered as children, so to speak. A case could be made for the politics of Amélie, that's true. But on the other hand, it's tricky. But I would certainly agree with you on the fact that there's a contradiction here. I agree.
When you spoke of the Americanization of France, it made me think about the phenomenon of French films being remade in the United States with an American version. And I naively thought that that was mostly because Americans don't like to watch films where they have to read the subtitles. But now I'm
Yes. Well, actually, yes. Well, the film critic I mentioned earlier, Bazin, did study that in the 1940s and 50s on the basis of an example which is Le Jour se lève by Marcel Carnet, Daybreak. And it's set in Aubervilliers, which is in a working class outskirt of Paris. And the American remake, I've forgotten the name of the director, but the American remake had a very different conception of space. Bazin said, but how can you make a remake of that film if you just ignore the milieu, that is the place where the action is set? It's absolutely impossible, and it doesn't make any sense, says Bazin. In saying that, Bazin is certainly very influenced by a certain conception of, I would say, French filmmaking, but also French literature. Let's think about the role of the place and the milieu in defining people's characters and people's fate. He's very influenced by that, and this is completely lost in translation. This is completely lost with the remake, says Bazin. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you the question of, let's see, you open your discourse on the question of with the French map, and films were not allowed in France. American films were not allowed in France. Was that before we entered the war or after?
That was during World War II, when there was censorship impacting British and American films. It was completely censored.
Was it before the Americans entered the war or after the Americans entered the war, or was it both?
It was during
I know
the
that the French themselves divided because you had the southern French,
right, the occupied and
the occupied, the Pétain, I think.
Yes,
And then the north was.
the Nazi.
I'm remembering a lot.
Yes, but later on, everything was invaded. So it didn't make a difference anymore, and the Nazis imposed that very strict censorship. And they did support French filmmaking, and there is this debate over whether the French tried to send subliminal messages to call for resistance despite the Nazis' censorship. So, long story short, let's think about all these films being made in Hollywood that were not visible in France during the occupation. And all of a sudden, very quickly in 1945, you had this massive wave of film coming from the US, and that included films like Citizen Kane. And millions of French people were just mesmerized by these films.
I'd like to elucidate on what you're saying. I believe there was a film, a Hollywood film, which was basically an anti-Nazi propaganda film called The Mortal Storm, which incensed Hitler so much that he banned all American films, I believe, in any territory under the control of Germany at the time.
Yes.
It was a purposely anti-Nazi film that triggered the ban, I believe.
But made in the US.
Yes, it was called The Mortal Storm.
Mm-hmm. And there is also Why We Fight by Frank Capra. Why We Fight. And many of those films were released in France, but some film critics said that that's interesting, but those propaganda films are not relevant because history is moving forward, so there was no need to see those films anymore. And in the case of Bazin, he was a bit mixed about that, because he thought that propaganda was so obvious that it was some kind of manipulation of the viewer, and he didn't like that at all. But the divide separating the resistance and the pro-Americans and the collaborators, it was a very vivid one amongst film critics. There were collaborators such as Lucien Rebattet, for instance, during World War II, or Brasillac. Think about Brasillac, who was shot dead for collaboration. So, yeah. Mm-mm.
When you're kind of thinking about the underlying political message in space in a film, do you consider the way that a different space for an audience would affect that? So, you know, does the political message of a film change depending upon whether we're watching it in France and we're French, or whether it's been imported to the US? Do you think that kind of can change what a film is politically, or
Yes.
have you thought about
No,
how does that-
it's a very good question. The degree to which the political agenda of a film is visible or understandable has a lot to do with reception studies, has a lot to do with who you are as a viewer, your gender, your age range, your social background probably, and maybe the geographical context in which you see the film. For instance, if we go back to Provence, not everybody on Earth necessarily knows what Provence means to a French person. If you're an American, a US citizen from a certain age group, maybe you may know that due to the popularity of France, especially in the 1950s and 60s. If you have a certain social background, maybe you have the money to go to France, you have European vacation, and your reception will be so different, absolutely. And the reception of a given landscape may vary, of course. If you're a French person, let's go back to Be and to Have, Être et Avoir. This film, which is about the educational system in France, was extremely popular amongst teachers. And we know that. Teachers were so happy to see that because they saw that film as such an amazing support system in a context where it's difficult to teach, where the concept of authority has been under attack. Some will, is it good, is it bad? That's not up to me to say. But a certain generation of teachers in France they're very nostalgic of that. And no wonder that the film was a hit, no wonder that they could relate to the safety zone of the classroom. A counterexample or a different conception of space in education in France would be Laurent Cantet's films entitled Entre les murs. I'm not sure of the translation. The Class. Thank you. It's a very different conception of space because you actually see the fights, the power struggle in the classroom. It's probably a more realistic film because that's closer to the experience of teaching in France right now, whereas To Be and to Have was maybe a romanticized or nostalgic conception. But yes, absolutely. It depends on who you are, where you come from, and that's why producers who want to make a lot of money with their films, they sometimes exert some pressure on the filmmakers to include such and such monument in their films to make sure that people all around the world will be interested in the film. Let's take this example of the film, a René Clair film entitled The Crazy Ray, Paris qui dort. It's a beautiful title, huh? Paris qui dort, The Crazy Ray. So you do see the Eiffel Tower all the time. That sells well worldwide because more or less everybody knows. I mean, you can recognize the monument. Let's take another example, La Talente, 1934, by Jean Vigo. The producer said to Jean Vigo, Mr. Vigo, you're so young, you're very talented, we love you, I'm going to give money for your film, but please, would you consider including the Eiffel Tower in your film at some point? That would help. That would be nice. And Vigo refused. He was not interested because he did not want the cliché. He did not want that. Or Jean Renoir, same thing, when he made The River. The River, it's set in India, a wonderful film. One of Martin Scorsese's favorite films, a wonderful film. he had a hard time producing his film because he did not want any shots representing a tiger or an elephant. And producers gave him a very hard time in Hollywood because of that. So space, landscapes do sell more or less, and the reception that is being made of those monuments does vary, yes, from a country to another. Mm-mm.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Francois. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.